Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Before you do, though, no, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So for those of you that weren't here last week, the way this works is we've got a microphone there. Microphone's very important because, as we said, there's we're recording this on television, and there's a lot of people watching on the web. So if you have comments or questions, and we've got people with a lot of knowledge of the region out here, if you could line up at the microphone and take turns, and we'll have either the panelists or the Pebble consultants respond depending upon what's most appropriate. So is there anybody that... Carol Ann, I knew you'd be good. And if you could start by prefacing your comments, by identifying yourself and your affiliation, that would be helpful.
Hello. Oops, there it goes. Hello, I'm Carol Ann Woody, and I've worked in fisheries in Alaska, primarily with salmon, since 1988. I've worked in the Kvichak watershed since 91. And my big question, and it's something that the people I work with are very concerned about. They're very concerned about how many adult salmon are going to be lost if this mine goes in. And as has been pointed out by Mr. Geiger, Dr. Geiger, and others, people here look at the value of salmon based on the adult salmon, because that's the next generation. In Alaska, we have been estimating within plus or minus 10% confidence the number of salmon coming back to our rivers, large rivers. These are small rivers. This isn't the Kvichak or the Nushagak. They're tributaries to it. I don't understand, with all the money, why you haven't tried other methods to get total escapement with a good confidence interval. The Pebble Limited Partnership has the resources. They have very smart people. You guys are very smart people. And yet you're giving us a mean index counts that doesn't tell us anything. Will the Pebble Partnership do a total escapement estimate for the people of Alaska?
Sounds like that's for Mary Lou.
I don't think it's for me. I'm a technical consultant. I think that's a policy decision that Pebble would have to address. So far, at this point in time, they've opted not to go the escapement route.
Well, as a scientist and also as someone who works with tribes there and works with fishermen and other people in the region, I highly recommend that the Pebble Limited Partnership actually go and get counts of the adult salmon that could be wiped out in that area. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. It looks like we've got a Pebble representative to address that.
Sure. Just a moment here to bring up back the idea that
Jane, can you
not
identify
quite close
yourself?
enough here. Jane Whitsett. That our approach is focused on habitat, and we will learn more about that this afternoon from the scientist who's been working on that. And we have not pursued the escapement as Mary Lou's presented it here and discussed. And as I mentioned this morning, you can't really manage a project by numbers of fish. We appreciate Caroline's comments with regard to escapement and Alaskans, and that's good information. But I just wanted to get our point across again. At the present time, our approach is to look at habitat, macroinvertebrates, and water quality. And when it comes to looking at the point that someday when we have a mine plan, that those are the tools that a project can use effectively.
Thanks, Jane. Looks like we've got another comment. Sarah, you can identify yourself first.
Okay, I'm Sarah O'Neill. I'm an aquatic ecologist with Fisheries Research and Consulting here in Anchorage. And I wanted to ask Audra, I understood from your presentation that you repeat sampled 2 sites in the Koktulis and 1 site in the Upper Tulare?
I'm sorry, two sites in the North Fork Koktuli, 2 sites in the Upper Tulare, and 1 site in the South Fork Koktuli.
Okay, so I'm just, because my understanding is that this is at least one of the objectives of these studies are to characterize baseline conditions. Do you, as an aquatic ecologist yourself, do you consider that sufficient to characterize baseline conditions and to measure potential impacts down the road from a mine, particularly without reference sites outside the area of impact?
I do think that it was either Charlotte or Jane that talked about the purpose of the data that were collected, and those are for the purpose, for example, of an affected environment and to be able to characterize the environment for an affected environment for a NEPA document. I do feel like that those data would be useful in that sense if we were talking about a potential future monitoring scenario. I do think we would need to come back and look at the data that have been collected, the sites that have been established, and reassess that with the mine plan that is being brought forward.
So you agree that this data isn't sufficient for potential future monitoring?
I don't agree with that. I'm saying we would need to take a look at those data in light of a potential mine plan when it is brought forward.
Okay, I guess I would just suggest that you consider expanding those repeat sampling sites and adding reference sites for future monitoring.
Thank you.
All right.
I'll ask a question. And this has to do with, I guess, presentation of material. My name is Sam Snyder, Alaska Conservation Foundation. For both the bug studies and the fish studies, it's clear from the presentations today that you have been paying some attention to critiques that are going on aspects of the environmental baseline documents. Your responses to those critiques, at least from a lay public paying attention to this on the outside, sounds as though you anticipated those critiques, both with the bug studies, QA/QC, as well as some of the mean index counts issues in the fish studies. You anticipated those critiques in advance of these meetings or in advance of releasing the EBD, but it's just now that, say, the public is getting an explanation as to why those issues might have existed, and I'm curious why you didn't include those conversations within the EBD itself.
There were documents that were prepared and provided to Pebble and their consultants by independent scientists. We were provided with those documents in preparation for this meeting. So yes, we did know that those critiques were there, and we intentionally addressed them today.
Sure. Yeah, you addressed them today, but in your addressing them, and maybe I just misunderstood the presentations, you made it sound as though you anticipated those. You saw those problems back in January when you released the EBD. And so I'm curious why in, say, a methods discussion in the bugs, in the macroinvertebrate section, you didn't discuss the quality, the QA/QC issues then, and you're just addressing them now. I guess that's the question. Yeah, you just got the independent critiques now, but you spoke as though you knew those issues existed, say, in December. And maybe I just misunderstood the presentations.
I can take this. I don't think that I indicated that we made those changes back in January or December. Essentially, we did receive the report, the review report, and there was a table in that report that had 18 taxa that were being questioned. And we, of course, went back into the data and into the quality control documents, and we found that issue that I talked about in my presentation, that 15 of those taxa had been flagged previously as needing to be changed to other taxa. It was an error. We have corrected that in our database at this time, and the table that I showed you on the screen was a reflection of how much that affects our EBD tables.
And I guess I just want to follow up with the mean index counts versus escapement, and there is a write-up in the EBD that addresses the inability to use escapement estimates and the resulting methods that were applied, taking a mean index count. So there is a write-up on that.
O'Neill again, Fisheries Research and Consulting. So looking at this is for Mary Lou, the pie charts of percent fish abundance, I suppose it is, or composition. How were those calculated? From what I could understand from the EBD, you took every sampling method and lumped them together to get those values?
Yeah, for the pie charts, there's a table in Appendix B that lists every method by year and the catch by species and life stage that resulted from that. And those data were summed for purposes of painting a picture of the overall habitat to do with species composition. It was total catch.
So, and was there any attempt to sort of calibrate observer efficiency between, because for example, like I know from snorkeling that it's much more difficult to see sculpin than it is when you're electrofishing, and I assume you were using electrofishing more upstream than you were using snorkeling more downstream. So do you think those methods are really comparable?
It was a total catch. It was all of the observations combined.
And you think that's a fair characterization of species composition?
I think it's what we had.
Okay. Okay, that's good, thanks.
Hi, my name is Rick Parkin. I'm with EPA. Broke the microphone.
Just hold on to it, Rick.
Okay. Can I keep it? No. So I have a question for the panel. So the mean index counts were compared directly to the escapement estimates in text and in graphics, and I just wonder from the panel if those comparisons are valid.
I'd like to start. So I've done a lot of work with these escapement counts, and I've flown over some streams in Bristol Bay and looked at fish, and we weren't really counting. We were just getting visual impressions. And I've also been in helicopters, and I've looked at Chinook salmon. And when I did that, it was a long time ago, but I was with 3 trained observers, and I was just the rookie, statistician. And my numbers were way off from everybody else's. The other 3 people saw about the same number of fish, and I didn't see anywhere near what they did. So I would think, first of all, to even be looking at these index counts and trying to make some sense of what they are, I think there needs to be a whole lot more information given to the reader. And I used the term before, an open-minded skeptic. I think there needs to be a whole lot more information given to demonstrate to us that they have counted something repeatedly, even if it isn't the total magnitude. So that was my take on that, and I don't think I see what looks like sort of some disagreements between total escapement and some of those escapement counts, and I don't know what that means. If some of those index counts are just it was just variability in that system, or if that's possibly some sort of non-sampling error. I guess that's kind of jargon, but if that's some sort of mistake in on the part of the observers. So I think I need a lot more information to judge what those escapement indices really mean.
Anybody else in the panel have a comment?
May I respond? There is a write-up in the EBD that associated with the graph that compares the index count to the catch statistics prepared by ADFG. And it is a disclaimer that says these are not comparable data, and we understand that. However, by putting this number next to this number, we can see the relative scale of the difference. And so even if you multiply the index count by 10, go ahead and give yourself a relative, some relative scale of what we're talking about here.
Well, so I understand that, but some of the discussion is pretty, not relative. So, for example, the EDB provides the estimates for total escapement to Bristol Bay and then total escapement of Chinook to to the Nushagak River, and then makes the statement, in contrast, the NFK, Chinook salmon mean index counts range from 157 to 1,800. So it looks like you're saying on the one hand, we have this total estimate of thousands of Chinook, over 100,000 Chinook, and in contrast, this tributary is only providing mean index counts, and the mean really can't be compared at all to a mean estimate can't be compared at all to a total estimate.
You know, that's why we have this idiomatic expression, apples and oranges. I mean, this is just an example of not being able to use algebra. We have to at some point be able to use algebra to bring these things to be comparable. And I think, well, I guess I'll say again, this is not unique to this problem. If you look at ADF&G's documents on escapement, you'll see some of these same problems and inconsistencies.
So one of the, there's something you always hear about the South Fork Koktali, which is always, oh, it goes dry sometimes. It's ephemeral. And it's almost as if it's not important. However, sockeye salmon have been found above that, correct?
There was one sockeye in SFKC, but that was below the drying reach. And there was a report of, I think, a handful of sockeye in Frying Pan Lake one year.
So there, but sockeye salmon have been found in Frying Pan Lake. And it was interesting you didn't include the most recent anadromous waters catalog information. You're using older anadromous waters catalog information, which doesn't show you how many salmon streams are actually up there. But there are salmon, correct, there are salmon directly on top of the deposit, both rearing and spawning. That's correct?
I don't have that information.
Well, it is correct. They are. They do spawn on top of it, and they do rear there. But the thing about the ephemeral reach, which troubles me, is you indicate that hydrologists have shown that it goes completely dry every winter. And I haven't seen evidence of that. Because if fish are spawning in that reach, which they do, coho spawn in that reach and other fish do, it might go dry on the surface, but you still have something called hypereic flow. Because it seems odd that you would have salmon documented as spawning there if it goes dry and kills everything, because it almost sounds as if there wouldn't be fish able to survive there.
We have not documented any fish spawning above the intermittent reach in the South Fork. We have documented coho juveniles above, and we have documented a handful of sockeye above.
Okay, but the Fish and Game Anadromous Waters catalog does show salmon spawning in those areas. It shows them going up to there. So I guess my concern is that people get the impression that perhaps the South Fork Koktali is not important because you have this area that goes dry. But it's not dry all of the time, and there's still a question of if fish spawn there and it looks like it goes dry on the surface, is there really hypereic flow going underneath there that keep embryos alive during the winter? And that's something that's not clear. So are there any other winter studies that are going to be planned? Because I know there were a couple of attempts and those were abandoned. Are there any more plans to do some winter work?
I don't know of any plans to do winter work. I do know that we're looking at a hypereic evaluation for the system for next year.
Because something that is remarkable about that region is the fact that there's so much open water in the winter, even when it's sub-zero, which indicates quite a bit of groundwater flow. And if you do, I mean, it would be good to do winter studies, particularly in a lot of those open areas, because those are a lot of the reaches that provide overwintering habitat. So I think it would be something worth looking at. And my last question is, I was unable to find in the environmental baseline document a table that shows the results of all of the escapement surveys where you flew X date, X year, and you counted X number of fish. So there's not a table. Is there a table anywhere that has all that information in it?
Raw data weren't put into the EBD.
Yeah, it's something that might be considered because it's extremely difficult to even evaluate the information if you can't look at a table with all of that through time of what you got to see what those numbers are. Because it's actually very difficult to tell how you calculated the mean index count. So anyway, thank you.
Well, I think I'll use moderator privilege and ask my own question for Mary Louise. So on the juvenile fish censuses, you've got a lot of work that's more or less presence-absence, but you had some reaches where you went and used a variety of methods like, serial electrofishing or something to try to come up with absolute abundance estimates. You're looking skeptical. I guess my question is, how successful do you feel you were at that, and is that information useful in any way for taking the rest of your data and getting an index or abundance or something from like single pass snorkeling surveys?
We did relative abundance, and we call it relative abundance because we weren't able to get absolute values. We did mark recapture several times and put our block nets up and found our marked fish outside of our block nets. And the next time we put up the block nets and we came back, the block net was gone. So we did mark recapture to try and calibrate those depletion estimates, electrofishing depletion estimates. And we did, others did multi-pass depletion estimates where they tried to actually get to zero and were not successful at getting to zero. So there were multiple calibration methods that were employed to get at a more of an absolute abundance, but I would say that we absolutely didn't get there. And that's why we use the term relative abundance. And, I think there are limitations to what you can say about relative abundance, especially when you use minnow traps, because you can get coho with minnow traps, and then you have to use something else for sculpin. It's a very complicated situation. It's a very challenging process to do this in these large river systems in Alaska. And it's a challenging process on other projects that are ongoing as well. I mean, it's something we all have to deal with and we all have to get at. And that is the reason for the table in Appendix B that lays out the catch by year, by life stage, by method, so that people can see what were more effective methods for different species and life stages. To paint a picture about what's out there and present that in an environmental baseline document to support a NEPA, we lump those together. Statistically, maybe there's a lot of error with that, but it's what we had. It's the best display of information to give people a picture of the fish assemblage. So, fall short of absolute abundance.
Doug Limpenso with No Fisheries Habitat in Anchorage. And, I swore I wasn't going to do this and ask questions, but actually, based on some of the presentation here, I thought it was relevant. I'm thinking, and Charles might be more of an expert on this, based on the current status of salmon down in the northwest, other places on the globe, there's an absence of salmon. Obviously, they're not spawning and rearing in these habitats, while there's appears to be plenty of benthic invertebrates and algae. in these tributaries. And so some of the thought here that I have heard was that Pebble plans to monitor habitat in invertebrates. And it kind of triggered a thought in my head. Are benthic invertebrates actually the best indicator of habitat quality? Because in some of the current literature and in my train of thought is, and I don't know specific levels of toxins, for example, metals, processing chemicals, or especially dewatering, are benthic invertebrates actually more sensitive, or algae more sensitive than embryonic or larval phase salmon? And just throwing out a general question, consideration.
Si, do you want to?
I can go ahead and start. The body of literature around using invertebrates and even periphyton as indicators is quite large. But that is a good question, because the whole purpose is to use these data together as a data set to look at change over time. So you are not only looking at the invertebrates, but you're also looking at the periphyton, and you're looking at the water quality, you're looking at the fisheries changes, and you're assessing those types of communities all together at the same time as diagnostic tools.
Si, do you want to weigh in?
Well, just in terms of responding about what's happening with salmon in the lower 48, really we look at it as the 4 H's, is not only habitat, but hatcheries, harvest, hydro, and so it is a multi-stressor system down there that, to a large degree, you're not facing up here. But I mean, I think I agree with Andra, is that the information behind, especially the IBI and approaches with benthic invertebrates, shows them to be exceedingly sensitive, especially at not only the taxonomic level, but the trophic level and other things. And it's a fairly well-established scientific approach. It's not saying that the salmon larvae and alevins aren't super sensitive, but I think from a diagnostic aspect, I think the benthic invertebrates has proven to be pretty effective.
Thanks. I think I'm waiting here for a question from the web.
Milo, I might just toss a question of curiosity to Mary Louise, or anybody for that matter, is what do you know about the genetic diversity of the population, subpopulations that are within the study area, within the area of potential influence, compared to the genetic diversity of, for instance, the Liamna stocks?
No genetic samples for anadromous salmon have been collected. There were some genetic samples collected for some of the, Dolly Varden, the resident forms that can have anadromous components, and those were delivered to the state. I don't know the status of that, but not for anadromous populations.
All right, so we have questions from the web from Sean Brennan directed at the panel. I'll have to preface it by saying that some of this gets into a mining scenario, but we'll read it anyhow, and you can see what part you might want to respond to. So there's 3 parts to this question. Please evaluate these questions both for the best case scenario where no accidents can occur and the only impact is habitat loss to mine area and associated infrastructure, and for the scenario where one or more of the potential accidents does occur, things like tailings dam failure, wastewater leak, pipeline spill. So some of that's outside the scope of what we're supposed to be doing, but I think the first couple of questions in particular, do you have an estimate for how many and which populations of Chinook coho and sockeye salmon will be at risk for significant perturbation, particularly extirpation. And then, given that populations at risk for extirpation make up part of the biodiversity of the Bristol Bay Fisheries Complex, and that this biocomplexity imparts stability, low-frequency fishery closures, currently 1 in 100 years, as indicated by Schindler et al. In Nature 2010. Do you have an estimate as to how the best-case scenario and the accidents case scenario will affect the frequency at which fisheries closures occur if the mine is executed, respectively? And the last question is, given the evaluation of the mine's effect on the fishery closure frequency, do you have an estimate of how much economically this will cost the fishery per unit time for the prospective lifetime or perpetuity of the mine? So again, I'll just reiterate for the audience that we're looking at baseline documents, and we're not really wanting to get into the details of mining scenario, but there are some components to the question here about what portion of the salmon stocks are in these affected area, and what portions of the some of the regional populations of these stocks are concentrated in the area potentially under the influence of the mine. I'm wondering, this was directed at the panel, but I guess the panelists or the consultants or Pebble people could make some response. Let me start with the panel members. Anybody want to weigh in?
I'll take a shot.
Thank you.
And the question was very quantitative, and we're just not there yet, obviously, but a lot of concern is expressed over the adults, how many are returning, where are they going, et cetera. And of course, that's where the value is. Adult fish is worth something, and the other life stages really aren't, except that they're what bring forth the adults later. And when you get when you start talking about various scenarios and incidences, the adult life stage, of course, is not very sensitive at all. It's the one you care about in terms of the harvest, but it's that embryo and it's the juvenile that are the life stages that are going to be the most sensitive to any sort of adverse scenario, whether it's climate change or a spill incident or what. And so that's why I was kind of getting at the habitat question of, so how much spawning habitat is there and how many are spawning there, because that tells you then how many embryos are likely to be there that could be vulnerable to a scenario. Likewise, then in the winter, not counting the embryos, it'll be for coho, for example, will be the juvenile life stage that's very concentrated in, say, the winter habitat, and just where is that winter habitat? Is it in the mine deposit type area, or is it downstream, or out of, say, a little less concern, or are those pockets going to be in critical habitats that could be affected by a specific scenario? So that's why I was kind of getting at both the habitat and the sensitivity or vulnerability of those eggs and embryos and juveniles. So when you know that answer, then you can have some sort of feeble attempt maybe at quantifying what the impact is to returning adults.
Anybody else?
Well, I guess first of all, I'll say, of course, I don't know the answer to those questions, and nobody does. But having looked at, having been part of discussions many times of why a salmon population declined, I know that if we don't, if Pebble doesn't really clearly outline the parts of the larger fishery populations that could be diminished or at risk, then when the overall salmon populations inevitably go down, as they do, and go back up as they do, when they go down, the people are going to be using that as evidence that the mine has diminished the salmon populations. And you don't have to do a lot of fancy calculations to just go back and look at the commercial catch going back now over 100 years to see that there's periods of real big dips. The early 70s, things went down. People virtually thought it was the end of the world. And if they had a mine or something to point to at that time, they would have concluded that the mine had caused it. So earlier in the introductory comments, I know I wrote down, we heard that the objectives of the EBD is to characterize what's there right now, and it's not for future monitoring. So I put that thought on a shelf. But then later we heard it's not possible to manage fishery impacts based on escapement. I thought, oh, okay, yes, I completely agree with that. The purpose of these escapements are not to, we can't just look at the little ups and downs that we've seen so much of over the decades to measure the effect that the mine might have. But there's this tension between these two things, one characterizing what's there right now, and then this need for future monitoring. And I think part of the problem is that those objectives haven't been teased apart enough, and that those of us who've been reading this haven't had that those two things kept separate enough, and that's why we have some of the confusion we have right now.
Anybody else? Let me again do a follow-up that's kind of inspired by this question. So there's this old paradigm that, you know, a Chinook is a Chinook and a sockeye is a sockeye, but the literature they're referencing is talking about the portfolio effect and biocomplexity and substructure and distinct population segments in some of these salmon populations. And so I'm wondering if anywhere in Pebble's planning, if they're wanting or planning to look at the salmon populations in this area to see if you know, they're part of a larger say component of river run sockeye, or whether in the Cook-Tule River that you have something that is got a unique life history, or maybe even genetic differences between what you see there and what you'd see in other areas of Bristol Bay. Is there any plan to look at whether there are distinct life history types or genetic differences, genetic differentiation between the fish that are potentially impacted by the mining operations and neighboring populations?
I think at the moment, Jane Whitson again, at the moment we don't have planned studies specific to what you're asking with regard to biodiversity and populations and how they might relate to greater populations beyond the project area itself.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
Stephen Gussack, and I'm a community associate for Pebble, and I have a comment and a question. And taking into consideration the life cycle of salmon species and taking a look at the index numbers that have been formulated, the cycle of salmon, you know, takes a period of time, you know, in some numbers where it's going to be fluctuating up and down. And from looking at the index numbers, they were from 2004 to 2008, which may play a factor in, you know, the numbers going down, because it takes 5+ years for salmon to return to their natural habitat. And my question is, in working with collaboration with the State of Alaska Department of Fish and Game in regards to setting up the tower, were they sharing those statistical numbers to kind of offset the numbers of the index, and is there any plan in the future in working with the state Department of Alaska Fish and Game in, getting a better statistical number of fish returning to the general area?
So the tower study was a specific study to compare the aerial survey method with the tower count method in these rivers. These rivers are different. All rivers are different than a lot of the rivers that are being flown for aerial surveys. They're very open. They're very low gradient. Water clarity is excellent. Low riparian vegetation. So the thought was that perhaps we could get a look at how the aerial surveys compared to tower counts, but the tower counts were not the 90% accuracy that they were supposed to be. The systems are small, and the fish respond dramatically to the presence of bears, and it turned out that you got more negative counts of adults than you did positive counts because of the placement of the tower and the effect of the bears as fish were moving up the creek. So there is no plan to do another tower evaluation. I don't know that there's any plan or discussion going on with ADFG to do any further refinement of counts at this time.
One more question for Mary Louise, Sam Snyder again. And this might actually be a question that might need to be tabled for this afternoon because it's, I guess, somewhat a habitat question. But you noted a large percentage of beaver pond in the study area, and I'm curious about the relationship between your counts across the board from anadromous to resident fish in those beaver pond areas, and if you could speak to, or I guess signal if Dudley will speak to the importance of beaver ponds and salmon habitat, in the Pebble Deposit area or sort of more generally. And I ask that because in the comments on the EPA's watershed assessment, Pebble and Northern Dynasty noted potentially removing beaver dams as a means to open up and improve salmon habitat, and that seems to go against what I believe is sort of common thinking in fisheries.
I was hoping to pass that off on you, Dudley. I think that the data that we have available to us indicates that there are not a lot of slow water habitats in these systems for smaller fish rearing in the systems, and that the off-channel habitat is very important. So that beaver habitat as off-channel habitat? That beaver is 90% of the off-channel habitat in the Hoogtlies.
All right, well, I'm guessing it's time to break for lunch. I saw a lot of really excellent box lunches sitting out there earlier. So what do you think, Todd? Reconvene at 1? Okay, we'll be back here at 1 o'clock.